It was Thursday, July 20th, 1944, and inside the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler's forward command post, the war's tide was already turning against Germany. In the concrete maze of bunkers and wooden barracks, officers and secretaries moved briskly, fanning themselves with folders, their uniforms clinging to sweat. The Eastern Front was collapsing, and the Führer had summoned his generals for yet another briefing. Among them walked a tall man with a missing right hand and a black leather glove on the left. His uniform was immaculate, his eyes sharp, almost feverishly calm. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, Chief of Staff to the Reserve Army, had arrived from Berlin on a flight that morning carrying a leather briefcase and a single purpose. He was here to kill Adolf Hitler. The low hum of cicadas outside mixed with the murmur of staff officers inside the wooden conference hut. Normally such meetings were held in an underground bunker, a place of reinforced concrete where a blast might have been contained. But on this sweltering day, Hitler ordered the meeting moved to a lightly built wooden barrack, its windows wide open to let in air. Fate had intervened, and not in the way Stauffenberg had hoped. At 12:30 p.m., Stauffenberg entered the conference room, flanked by Colonel Heinz Brandt and other staff officers. On the table before them lay maps of the Eastern Front, red arrows pointing westward, Soviet advances creeping toward Warsaw. Hitler leaned over the table, tracing lines with a pencil, his hands trembling but his voice firm. Stauffenberg's left hand trembled slightly as he set down his briefcase. The same hand that had survived the blast in North Africa the previous year, the explosion that had taken his right hand, 2 fingers and 1 eye. He moved carefully, clumsily, feigning normality as he unclipped the case, adjusted its contents, and slipped the detonator's pin. Inside, a British-made plastic explosive primed to detonate in 10 minutes. He placed the briefcase near Hitler, close enough to kill everyone in the room, and excused himself, claiming a phone call from Berlin. He stepped outside into the blinding light of noon. His adjutant Werner von Haften waited anxiously by the car. The two exchanged a silent glance. Behind them, the conference continued. Voices murmured. A map shifted. At 12:42 p.m., the world split open. The explosion shattered the wooden walls, ripping through the barracks with a roar that echoed across the Wolf's Lair. Flames burst from the windows, followed by a column of black smoke that climbed into the forest sky. Trees shuddered. Birds scattered. For a moment there was silence, and then chaos. Stauffenberg didn't look back. He was already in the car, speeding toward the airfield. He was certain, absolutely certain, that no one inside could have survived. The bomb had been close enough. It had to be. By the time his aircraft lifted off for Berlin, 4 men lay dead. But Hitler, by an extraordinary twist of fate, had survived. The heavy oak table had shielded him from the blast, and the briefcase had been moved seconds before detonation. To the far side of a table leg, at 1 p.m., the Führer emerged, from the wreckage, dazed ears wringing, his hair singed. His uniform was torn, but his voice was cold, steady, and alive. Ich bin unverletzt, he told his staff. I am unharmed. The plot to kill Hitler had failed, but in Berlin no one yet knew that. And as Stauffenberg's aircraft cut through the summer sky toward the capital, the wheels of Operation Valkyrie, the coup designed to seize control of the German government, began to turn. The sound of engines droned over the pine forests of East Prussia as Stauffenberg's Heinkel lifted into the summer sky. Below him, the wreckage of the Wolf's Lair still smoked, a cratered ruin of splintered timbers, shattered glass, and scattered papers. He did not look back. To him it was over. The plan had worked. Hitler was dead, and now everything depended on speed. By 1 p.m., the aircraft leveled westward for Berlin. In the cabin, Werner von Haften leaned toward Stauffenberg. Er ist tot, Stauffenberg whispered. He is dead. Haften nodded, his face pale but resolute. The long months of planning, the risk, the moral weight, all of it would now bear meaning. The monster was gone. But back in Rastenburg, the monster had risen from the smoke. Hitler's adjutants had dragged him from the debris moments after the explosion. His eardrums were ruptured, his right arm mangled, but he was alive, shielded by the thick leg of an oak table that had deflected the blast. Within the hour, the Reich was already spreading the word. Der Führer lebt. And though the world did not yet know it, the coup that could have ended, the war was already beginning, to crumble before it had even begun. At the Bendler block in Berlin, General Friedrich Olbricht paced his office, his nerves drawn tight as wire. The phone lines buzzed with fragments of information, conflicting reports, broken connections. Was Hitler dead? No confirmation. Had Stauffenberg escaped? Unknown. Still, Olbricht hesitated. He knew the risk. If Hitler lived even for an hour, activating Operation Valkyrie would mean certain death. He looked to Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, his chief of staff. They waited for a call from Stauffenberg, a single code phrase that would ignite the entire plan. At 3 p.m., the call came through. A voice crackled over the line from the airfield. The Führer is dead. The explosion succeeded. Ulbricht took a long breath, then turned to his staff. It begins now, he said quietly. Valkyrie is in effect. Within minutes, the Bendler block came alive with motion. Telephones rang in rapid succession. Couriers sprinted down corridors carrying sealed envelopes stamped top secret. Across Berlin, the Home Army was being mobilized. Reserve battalions were ordered to occupy the Reich Chancellery, the Propaganda Ministry, and Gestapo headquarters. In Munich, Vienna, and Paris, local commanders received the same coded orders. The Führer is dead. The SS has attempted a coup. Restore order. To most officers, the deception was perfect. Valkyrie was a legitimate emergency plan, one they had drilled for. They had no idea it was now being turned against the very regime that had written it. At 4:30 p.m., Stauffenberg's car arrived at the Bendler block. He emerged calm, composed, the dust of travel still on his uniform. Around him, officers saluted, unaware that the fate of the Reich hung by a thread. He strode into the operations room and clasped Ulbricht's hand. "It's done," he said. "Hitler is dead. The time is now." In that moment, the coup began in earnest. Orders went out to arrest Himmler, Göring, and Goebbels, and to occupy key ministries across the capital. Telegrams were dispatched to army group commanders in Prague, Vienna, and the Western Front. For the first time in 12 years, the machinery of Hitler's own army was turning against him. But the machinery of the Reich was faster. At the Wolf's lair, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler and propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels were already moving to contain the threat. Hitler, still trembling but alive, demanded immediate proof of loyalty. At 4:00 p.m., he ordered General Keitel to telephone Berlin. His voice, hoarse and furious, carried across the line. "Stauffenberg has tried to kill me. He must be arrested immediately." Keitel's words spread through the channels like poison. Commanders who had hesitated now froze. In Paris, General von Stauffenberg arrested SS officers, as planned, unaware that Hitler still lived. In Berlin, however, confusion reigned. Reports clashed. Some said the Führer was dead. Others said he was addressing the nation by radio within the hour. By 5:00 p.m., the fragile illusion began to fracture. Inside, the Bendler block, Stauffenberg and his men fought against time and disbelief. General Beck, the elder statesman of the resistance, had arrived calm and dignified. He was to become the new head of state once Valkyrie succeeded. But he sensed the hesitation around him, younger officers whispering, questioning, doubting. They had pledged loyalty to Hitler with their lives. Could they now turn against him on a rumor? Stauffenberg slammed his fist on the table. "I saw the explosion myself," he shouted. "No one could have survived that." His voice carried through the operations room, echoing down the hallways. Men paused at their desks, uncertain whether to believe or to fear. At 6:00 p.m., Ulbricht issued the final Valkyrie orders in full. Berlin's reserve army units began to move. Troops from the Guard Battalion Grossdeutschland deployed into the streets, setting up checkpoints and surrounding the Reich ministries. The city, under a pale evening sun, was suddenly filled with soldiers, some believing they were defending the Reich, others secretly working to overthrow it. For a brief, flickering hour, it worked. The Reich Chancellery was cut off. The Gestapo building was surrounded. And in those moments, the dream of a different Germany, a lawful, honorable Germany, seemed within reach. But far to the north, reality was catching up. At 7 p.m., Goebbels received a call from the Wolf's lair. Hitler wanted to speak directly to Berlin to prove he lived. Goebbels picked up the receiver and connected the line to his private office. Moments later, Major Otto Rehmer, commander of the troops encircling the propaganda ministry, was summoned. He entered suspicious but obedient. Goebbels handed him the phone. "Major, the Führer wishes to speak with you." Rehmer froze as the familiar voice came through, rough and unmistakable. "Rehmer, this is the Führer. You have been misled. The traitors are in the Bendler block. Arrest them immediately." The line went dead. Rehmer straightened, turned, and saluted. Within minutes, his men were in motion, heading not for the Chancellery, but for the conspirators' own headquarters. At 8:00 p.m., the streets of Berlin shifted again. Where an hour before soldiers had stood guarding doorways, now they turned their weapons inward. Phone lines to the Bendler block were cut. Rumors spread like fire. The Führer lives. The coup has failed. Inside, Stauffenberg stood by the window, listening to the rising noise outside, engines, boots, distant shouts. He realized what had happened. For all their courage, all their precision, they had been defeated by a single voice on a telephone. At 9:00 p.m., the lights flickered as Major Rehmer's forces surrounded the Bendler block. Machine guns were positioned at the entrances. No one was to leave. Inside, the men who had dared to defy Hitler now faced the night. Night descended over Berlin like a shroud. The air was still heavy with heat and tension, the city holding its breath beneath the dull glow of blackout lamps. At the Bendler Block headquarters of the German army, reserve, the conspirators moved through the halls like ghosts, their brief dream of a free Germany collapsing minute by minute. Outside, the streets echoed with the low rumble of engines. Major Otto Remmer's troops, once under their control, had surrounded the building. Machine gun nests were set at the corners, bayonets fixed, every window watched. Inside, telephones rang, unanswered messages were intercepted, and the sound of boots on marble grew closer with every passing hour. It was 10 p.m. July 20th, 1944. Only 10 hours had passed since the explosion at the Wolf's Lair. By dawn, the men who had dared to kill Hitler would be dead. In the second-floor operations room, Stauffenberg, General Ulbricht, Colonel Merz von Quernheim, and General Ludwig Beck gathered around a single desk lamp. Its dim light threw long shadows across their faces. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the faint scent of ink and sweat. A young officer burst in panic, etched into his features. "Major Remer has switched sides," he gasped. "He's spoken to the Führer by telephone." Silence followed, a silence that seemed to hollow out the room itself. For a moment, no one moved. Then Stauffenberg straightened, his expression calm, almost serene. "Then it's over," he said quietly. Ulbricht pressed his hand against his forehead. He had served the Reich all his life, a soldier of order and discipline. Now that same discipline would kill him. At 10:30 p.m., Remer's men entered the building. Doors slammed open. Boots pounded on the stairwells. In the courtyard, trucks idled, their headlights off, waiting. The conspirators had already been declared traitors by Hitler himself. Orders were clear. They were to be arrested, and if they resisted, shot. In a small adjoining room, General Beck removed his spectacles and sat at a desk. He reached into his coat for his pistol, an old 7.65mm Walther. Ulbricht stepped toward him, but Beck raised a hand. "This is my responsibility," he said softly. "No one else's." He placed the barrel to his temple and fired, but the shot went wide, glancing off bone. He slumped forward, wounded but alive. A soldier entered, pale-faced, and quietly delivered the final bullet. The sound echoed through the halls, the end of the old German general staff and of the honor it once claimed. Down the hall, chaos unfolded. Officers loyal to the regime burst into the operations room, shouting orders. Stauffenberg reached for his sidearm, a 7.65mm Browning. He had no illusions about what would happen next. They would not be tried. They would not be spared. A brief scuffle erupted. Werner von Haeften, ever loyal, stepped in front of his commander, shielding him from the soldiers' blows. Both men were disarmed, dragged from the room, their uniforms torn. They were led downstairs past walls lined with portraits of German heroes, men who had once believed honor meant obedience. Now it meant something else entirely. In the courtyard below, the summer air was heavy with diesel fumes and sweat. A single lamp burned above the archway, casting long shadows on the cobblestones. An officer, Major Remer himself, read out the charges. High treason, attempted murder of the Führer, conspiracy against the Reich. There would be no trial. The order was simple: execution immediately. Shortly before midnight, 4 men were brought into the courtyard: Stauffenberg, Ulbricht, Merz von Quernheim, and Haeften. They stood before a shallow earth embankment illuminated by a single truck headlight. A squad of soldiers assembled opposite, them rifles slung at their shoulders. Witnesses would later recall the eerie calm of that moment. No pleading, no speeches, only the scrape of boots and the mechanical click of rifles being readied. Stauffenberg stood tall despite his wounds, his left arm bound in a sling, his uniform stained with travel and blood. He looked out into the darkness, not toward his executioners, but beyond them, into the night sky over Berlin. He whispered something, words that would survive only in fragments. "Long live our sacred Germany." A volley of rifle fire cracked through the air. Stauffenberg fell backward. His body illuminated for a moment in the truck's headlights before crumpling into shadow. Beside him, Haeften collapsed almost in the same breath, his last act to step in front of his commander as the rifles fired. It was 12:30 a.m., July 21st, 1944. The coup was over. By dawn, the courtyard was silent again. The bodies had been carried away. The same soldiers who had executed them now cleaned their rifles, expressionless. Inside the building, Goebbels's men had already begun to clear the offices, seizing papers, burning documents, striking names from rosters. Hitler's vengeance was only beginning. Before the sun rose, the Reich announced that a small clique of criminal officers had been eliminated. Goebbels's press release called them cowardly traitors, their plot crushed by the Führer's providence. The radio broadcast carried Hitler's voice, bruised, shaking but alive. He thanked divine destiny for his survival and promised retribution. Retribution came swiftly. Within days, the Gestapo rounded up thousands. By the end of the month, more than 7,000 people were arrested, and nearly 200 executed not by bullet but by hanging on piano wire filmed for Hitler's amusement. Their families were shamed, their names erased from military records. Even Stauffenberg's wife Nina was imprisoned, her children scattered into state custody. The Bendler block itself became a place of quiet dread. Its walls, once echoing with orders and typewriters, now stood silent, marked forever by what had happened there that night. Yet amid the terror, whispers remained. Among soldiers at the front, among civilians huddled under bombed roofs, a single question lingered. What if they had succeeded? The answer no one would ever know. But for one night in July 1944, a handful of men had stood against the darkness, not for power, not for gain, but for the idea that Germany might still redeem its soul. Their act had failed in life, but in death it had become something else. Proof that even in the heart of tyranny, conscience could still draw its sword. The day after the coup, Berlin awoke to a new kind of silence, the silence of fear. The streets, still littered with fragments of glass and shell casing from the night before, seemed emptied of life. Even the wind through the lime trees of the Tiergarten carried a strange stillness, as if the city itself were listening for the echo of marching boots. At 7:00 a.m., July 21, 1944, the Reich's radio stations came alive. The voice that Germany had not expected to hear again spoke slowly, deliberately trembling with contained fury. A very small clique of ambitious, irresponsible, and at the same time senselessly stupid officers have committed a crime unparalleled in German history. It was Adolf Hitler alive, defiant, and burning with vengeance. He declared that the plotters have been exterminated, and promised that the rest will follow. In those words, the machinery of terror began to grind once more, faster, harsher, more merciless than ever before. That morning across the Reich, telephones rang in Gestapo offices. Orders went out from Heinrich Himmler's headquarters. Immediate arrests of all known associates of Stauffenberg, Ulbricht, Beck, and their circle. In Berlin, Munich, Vienna, Paris, and Prague, lists were compiled and dispatched with chilling precision. By evening, the net had already caught its first hundreds. Major General Henning von Treschow, one of the earliest conspirators and the moral heart of the resistance, was serving on the Eastern Front near Białystok when he heard the news. He knew what it meant not only for himself, but for everyone he had ever spoken to in trust. That afternoon, he walked alone into a copse of birch trees beside the road. He handed his orderly a message to his wife. Better to die with honor than to live in shame. Then he placed a grenade beneath his chin and pulled the pin. The explosion was muffled by the forest, but the echo of his defiance would live on. In Berlin, the Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse came alive through the night. Prisoners were dragged in, officers, secretaries, wives, even family friends. They were interrogated, beaten, and broken in the cellar rooms, their confessions scrawled in blood and ink across reams of paper. By the end of July, more than 200 officers were in custody, many of them decorated war heroes, men who had fought for Hitler in Poland, France, and Russia. The Führer's wrath was boundless. He saw in their betrayal not only treason, but blasphemy, a personal affront to his destiny. To avenge it, he unleashed the full horror of his justice. The People's Court, or Volksgerichtshof, was convened in early August under the direction of Roland Freisler, a former lawyer turned zealot who spoke like a man possessed. The trials were not trials at all, but theater, a grotesque parody of justice filmed for Hitler's private viewing. Inside the wood-paneled chamber, the accused were dragged before Freisler in torn uniforms, their insignia ripped away. He screamed at them from the bench, pounding his fists, calling them swine and traitors to the blood of Germany. He would not allow them to speak. When they tried, he shouted them down, his voice rising to a shrill, manic pitch. The verdict was always the same: death. The first to die were General Ulbricht, Colonel Merz von Quernheim, and Werner von Haeften, already executed in the Bendler block. But soon came others. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben dragged into court without his belt or dentures, forced to hold up his trousers as Freisler ranted. General Erich Höppner, once a commander of the Panzer Corps, stood silently as his sentence was read, refusing to bow. Each man was condemned not as an officer, but as an enemy of the Reich. The executions took place not by firing squad that was too dignified, but by hanging. In the Berlin Plötzensee prison, the condemned were strung up with piano wire, slow and deliberate. The process filmed for Hitler's private satisfaction. The footage, smuggled and later described by witnesses, showed the victims struggling for breath, the light fading from their eyes as the guards watched in silence. By September, Karl Goerdeler, the former mayor of Leipzig and one of the civilian leaders of the conspiracy, had been captured. He endured months of interrogation before his execution in February 1945. His last words were a prayer. May God bless Germany. The purge reached even the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service that had sheltered many of the plotters. Its chief admiral Wilhelm Canaris, once among the most powerful men in the Wehrmacht, was stripped of rank, imprisoned, and tortured. In the final weeks of the war, he too would be hanged. His body left swinging beside those of his comrades. The circle widened further still. Wives, brothers, sons, all deemed Sippenhaft guilty by blood. Nina von Stauffenberg, pregnant with her 5th child, was arrested and imprisoned at Ravensbrück concentration camp. Her children were taken from her, renamed, and scattered across foster homes under assumed identities. For months she did not know whether her husband had succeeded, nor how he had died. When she was liberated by Allied troops in 1945, she weighed less than 90 pounds. By autumn, the resistance within the German army was gone. What remained were whispers and ghosts. Men who might have stood with Stauffenberg kept silent, fearful, watching as their comrades vanished one by one. The Gestapo reports filled file after file, signed confessions, interrogations, final notes from condemned men. One such note found among the papers of a junior officer read simply, "We failed to kill the monster, but at least the world will know that some of us tried." For Hitler, the failed plot brought a terrible satisfaction. He called it proof of divine providence. From that day forward, he would trust no one. Even his closest generals were watched. His food tested, his meetings shortened. He no longer traveled by train fearing sabotage. He was in every sense a man hunted by his own paranoia. But if his enemies had been destroyed, so too had his faith in the army. The Wehrmacht, once a proud institution, was now shackled to the SS and the party. Thousands of officers were dismissed, demoted, or replaced by younger fanatical loyalists. The result was a new kind of war, one without restraint, fought to the bitter end. In the darkened cells of Plötzensee and the torture chambers of the Gestapo, the resistance died in pieces. Yet their memory, unspoken, forbidden, endured in the quiet hearts of those who had seen enough of blood and lies. For some, it was a flicker of shame. For others, a fragile hope. When the Allies finally entered Berlin 10 months later, they would find the city in ruins, the Reich reduced to ash and rubble. But among the shattered walls of the Bendler Block, flowers would one day be placed on the cobblestones where Stauffenberg fell, and a plaque would be raised in his name. History would come to see that moment not as treason, but as redemption. The war ground on. The summer of 1944. Once heavy with hope for the conspirators, dissolved into a long, blood-red twilight. In the east, the Red Army poured through the broken front lines of Army Group Center, rolling westward in an unstoppable tide. In the west, Allied columns pushed from Normandy into the heart of France. And in Berlin, the walls of Hitler's Reich tightened like a noose. But even as the front collapsed, the shadow of July 20th hung over Germany, like a haunting presence, an invisible scar that divided the nation's conscience. In the corridors of the Wolf's Lair, Hitler moved like a ghost of himself. His right arm still trembled from the blast, the bones of his hand fused by shrapnel. Every few hours he called for his adjutants to bring him the film reels of the peoples, court trials demanding to watch the condemned men die again and again. He would lean forward in the flickering light of the projector, his lips drawn tight, murmuring, "They deserved worse." Around him the circle grew smaller. Gone were the old generals, the aristocrats, the staff officers, the men of conscience who had dared to question him. In their place came the fanatics' men, like Otto Skorzeny, Hermann Fegelein, and the younger officers of the SS who lived for the Führer's favor. For them, the July plot proved that doubt was treason and mercy weakness. The war would now be fought, with blind faith, even as the walls of the Reich crumbled around them. But outside the Führer's bunker in the homes of ordinary Germans, the story was whispered differently. In hushed voices behind drawn curtains, people spoke of those officers who tried. At first, the official line that Stauffenberg and his circle were traitors was all anyone dared repeat. But as the bombers came, as sons and fathers vanished on the front, as the Gestapo dragged neighbors away in the night, the word traitor began to lose its sting. By winter, even in the ruins of Berlin, some whispered it with reverence. In the Wehrmacht itself, the plot left a wound that would never fully heal. Many officers had known of the rumors, some had even sympathized, but chosen silence. Now they carried that silence like a burden. Among the survivors, it became a private torment. What if we had acted sooner? What if we had all stood with them? There was no answer. The war consumed everything before it could be spoken. In London, the news of the failed assassination reached the British War Cabinet 2 days later. Churchill read the reports in silence. His reaction was not triumph, but something like sorrow. He remarked to his aides, "They tried to save their country, though too late. The world will remember that not all of Germany followed the madman." In Washington, Roosevelt saw it as a sign of weakness inside the Nazi regime, but also as confirmation that the war had to be fought to the end. There could be no negotiated peace, not even with the good Germans. The world had seen too much death to trust again. Still among Allied intelligence officers, the story of Stauffenberg's bomb sparked fascination. Reports from the OSS and SOE described the conspirators with a strange mixture of respect and disbelief, men who had finally acted when so many had not. Some even suggested post-war recognition for their moral courage. But the politics of victory were cold and practical. The world was not yet ready to absolve Germany. By 1945, when Berlin lay in ruins, the July 20th conspirators were already half forgotten. Their names were erased from official records. Their families scattered. Only in private letters hidden in walls buried in gardens or smuggled to Switzerland did their voices survive. One such letter came from Ulrich von Hassel, a diplomat who had joined the resistance early on. Before his arrest, he wrote, "We must not think of success, only of duty. Even if the deed fails, it will stand as proof that the spirit of freedom was not dead in Germany." He was executed at Plötzensee in September 1944. But his words endured, fragments of conscience preserved in the ashes of a collapsing empire. When the Allies occupied Germany, they uncovered the remains of the conspiracy. In Gestapo archives, lists, photographs, interrogations, and fragments of destroyed letters. The names stunned even the victors. Generals, diplomats, theologians, economists, men who had once stood at the heart of the Reich. It became clear that this was not a small cabal, but a wide web of Germans who had chosen defiance over obedience, for many in the West especially. In Britain, this revelation softened the view of post-war Germany. If such men had existed, men like Beck-Treschow-Gürtler and Stauffenberg, then perhaps Germany was not entirely lost to darkness. It planted the first seeds of what would later become reconciliation, though it would take decades to grow. In the East, under Soviet occupation, the story was buried. The Communists dismissed the July plot as a bourgeois rebellion, the failed treason of aristocrats, not the act of true resistance. Only after the fall of the Berlin Wall would the full story be told on both sides of a divided nation. For Nina von Stauffenberg, liberation came with both relief and grief. She was reunited with her children in the spring of 1945, their hair cropped short, their names replaced with numbers. In the ruins of her country, she began to piece together what had happened. When she learned that her husband's body had been burned and his ashes scattered, in secret she wept not for his death, but for the silence that had swallowed his memory. Yet even in her loss, she refused bitterness. In the years after the war, she spoke of her husband not as a martyr, but as a soldier who did his duty, the highest duty a man can do when all others fail. Her voice would become one of the first to remind post-war Germany of the courage that had existed in its darkest hour. By the early 1950s, a new Germany was rising from the rubble. The Bundeswehr, the new German army, faced a question that cut deep into its soul. Could it honor the resistance of July 20th men who had betrayed their oaths while still building an army founded on discipline and loyalty? It was a paradox, and yet the answer shaped the identity of modern Germany. The new army chose to see Stauffenberg and his comrades not as traitors, but as the moral foundation of its own code. Their portraits were hung in officers' academies. Their story became required study. The men who had once been condemned for treason were now honored as symbols of conscious soldiers who proved that duty to humanity stands above duty to orders. The quiet years that followed as Europe healed, the world came to understand the weight of that moment, July 20th, 1944, not as a failed coup, but as a moral turning point. For a few hours, amid the thunder of war and tyranny, Germany had tried to free itself from its own nightmare. It had failed, but the act itself had meaning beyond success or failure. The sound of Stauffenberg's final words still echoes through history: "Long live Holy Germany." It was not the Germany of conquest or ideology, but the Germany that sought redemption through sacrifice. When the memorial flame at the Bendler block was finally lit decades later, its inscription bore no pride, only solemn remembrance. You did not bear the shame. You resisted. You gave the great example to the world. In that quiet courtyard where the cobblestones still show the marks of bullets, visitors often stand in silence. The air is still, the city hums beyond. The walls and the memory of that one desperate night lingers. The night when a single bomb almost changed the course of the world. The war ended, not with victory for the conspirators, but with silence. When the guns fell quiet in May 1945, Germany lay in ruins, its cities leveled, its people broken, its leaders dead or imprisoned. Yet beneath the ash and rubble something fragile remained, the faint memory of men who had stood against the storm. For years, their story slept in the shadows, buried beneath the rubble of a nation struggling to survive. The world was weary of heroism, and Germany itself, shamed and divided, was not yet ready to face its own reflection. But the name Stauffenberg endured, whispered first in grief, then in reverence. It became more than a man's name. It became a question: what is duty? And what does it mean to stand against evil when obedience demands silence? In the first years after the war, the Allied occupation authorities avoided glorifying the resistance. To many, all Germans were complicit, all were responsible. Yet a few historians and former officers quietly began to collect the fragments of the story. Letters, diaries, court transcripts smuggled out of the Volksgerichtshof, and testimonies from surviving witnesses. They painted a picture not of treachery, but of moral defiance born from desperation. By the 1950s, the truth began to surface. Public discussion of the July plot, long considered taboo, found its voice again. In West Germany, memorials were erected at Plötzensee prison and the Bendler block where Stauffenberg and his comrades had fallen. Schoolchildren began to learn their names. The government officially recognized them not as traitors, but as patriots who had tried to restore honor to a nation lost to madness. And in the ranks of the new Bundeswehr, the lessons of 1944 became law. Young officers were taught that their oath was not to a ruler, nor to a flag, but to the Constitution, to the principles of justice and humanity. It was a transformation born from blood, the understanding that blind obedience is no virtue, and that moral courage is the soldier's highest duty. In East Germany, the story was more complicated. The communist regime saw the July plot not as resistance, but as a power struggle among aristocrats. They elevated instead the memory of socialist and communist resistors, men and women of the underground, as the true heroes of the anti-Nazi fight. For decades, the name Stauffenberg was almost absent from the official narrative east of the Iron Curtain. Only when the wall fell in 1989 did the two halves of Germany begin to share a single memory, to recognize that courage had taken many forms. Around the world, historians came to see Operation Valkyrie as one of the most extraordinary episodes of moral defiance in modern history. It was not merely a coup. It was a cry of conscience inside a machine built on fear. The conspirators knew the odds. They knew Hitler was paranoid, that his inner circle was loyal, that their communications were compromised, and that success might bring civil war. But they acted anyway because to do nothing would have been to accept evil as normal. That is the essence of their legacy. The July 20th men did not fight to win power or to save themselves. They fought to save the soul of their nation, to leave a record that not all Germans had followed blindly. Their bomb did not destroy Hitler, but it shattered the myth of absolute obedience. In the decades that followed, their story spread beyond Germany's borders through memoirs, films, and the testimonies of survivors. Books such as They Almost Killed Hitler and Valkyrie reached audiences across the world. Their narrative carried a message that transcended nationality, that even in a time of terror, individuals could still choose decency over fear. When the 2008 film Valkyrie brought their story to a new generation, some critics dismissed it as Hollywood romanticism. But for others, especially in Germany, it was something deeper. It was the sound of recognition. The story of a man standing before the abyss, knowing he would die but acting anyway because conscience demanded it. Today, the Bendler block stands quiet, preserved as a place of memory. Visitors walk through its courtyard where the cobblestones are darkened by age and rain. On one wall, a bronze plaque bears the words, "You did not bear the shame. You resisted." Every year on July 20th, a wreath is laid there by Germany's leaders. The modern Bundeswehr stands in formation, heads bowed, the air filled with solemn stillness. For a moment, time seems to fold back on itself, and the ghosts of that night return. Stauffenberg, Haften, Ulbricht, Quirnheim, men who believed that a nation could redeem itself through sacrifice. Their courage is no longer forgotten. It is the moral foundation of the Republic that rose from the ruins they left behind. But the legacy of Operation Valkyrie is not bound to one place or one nation. It speaks to every generation that faces the temptation of obedience, the weight of fear, and the question of what it means to do right when the cost is everything. In every dictatorship, in every system that demands silence, there are those who remember Stauffenberg and the moment he set down his briefcase and changed history, if only for a heartbeat. His act reminds us that resistance does not always succeed, but it matters. It draws a line between darkness and conscience, between what is permitted and what must never be accepted. It reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph of duty over despair. The sound of that July morning has long since faded, the echo of the explosion, the shouts, the gunfire in the Bendler Block courtyard, but in another sense it has never stopped. It reverberates through the pages of history, through every act of defiance that followed, from Budapest to Prague, from Santiago to Kiev, wherever men and women have chosen to stand for what is right. That is the true victory of Operation Valkyrie. Not the fall of a tyrant, but the rise of a conscience. The conspirators died believing their Germany had perished. But in the quiet dawn of a divided, rebuilding nation, their dream returned, not in triumph, but in remembrance. And so when we speak of them now, it is not with sorrow alone, but with gratitude. For they proved that even in a world drowning in obedience and terror, one man's moral courage can still shake the pillars of tyranny. In the end, they failed to kill Hitler, but they succeeded in reminding the world that conscience still breathes even under the weight of tyranny. And sometimes that is enough to change the course of history.